In this episode, we explore the transformative role of AI in cybersecurity with Martin Holste, CTO for Cloud and AI at Trellix. An expert in tech innovation, Martin shares how AI and cloud technology are revolutionizing cyber defense, from threat detection to advanced data protection. Join us to gain insights into the future of secure technology. Subscribe to the channel for more informative content like this.
Welcome everyone, this is Riaz Yusuff. I'm a Chief Information Officer and your host. Today, I'm excited to have Martin Holste as my guest. Martin is a Chief Technology Officer for Cloud and AI at Trellix. I had the privilege of attending Martin's engaging presentation recently about cybersecurity, and that's where I met him. Welcome, Martin. Thank you for joining the show. Could you please go ahead and introduce yourself?
Thanks for having me. I'm Martin Holste. I'm the CTO for Cloud and AI at Trellix. As you mentioned, I handle a lot of different things there, including partnerships, alliances, but I think the most fun that I have is how those all mix together in AI, and that's been a huge passion of mine now for the last few years.
That's great. I'm glad that you mentioned AI because last several months, there isn't a day when I did not hear about AI or mention about AI myself. So since you're on the cybersecurity side of things, I'm curious, what do you think the impact of AI in cybersecurity? What are some of the things that you're seeing, and what are you forecasting to happen in the near future?
Yeah, we've seen, obviously, as you said, a ton on AI. And I think the problem has been that it's been kind of looked at as a shiny new technology. And I think, in my opinion, the industry has looked at it as this new thing, and they say, well, how can we apply this new thing to, how we've been, conducting security over, the last several decades. And I think for the vast majority of them out there, they really haven't done that. What they've found is they've been two separate components, one being something that you interact with, a chatbot, for instance, and then the other being sort of the day in, day out jobs that exist for anyone in security. And there are a lot of different roles that we fill in security itself, a lot of different tasks that we have. And when I compare the stories that we see out there on how AI is used in security, it doesn't really match up the way that I typically see, the actual roles and responsibilities in security. And so that's something that I've really been pushing to solve, and Trellix at large has been pushing to solve, to say, okay, let's forget about the fact that it's new technology. Let's just look at AI as technology and how can this help get work done versus, hey, can we play with this new toy? And I think that's, really the difference in approach, and how you have to look at it is not, okay, what can we do that's new and different? It's what can we do that's new and different and helpful, as in how do we get things done that we don't want to have to do?
I see. So you said it doesn't match up in terms of what you see as AI skill set and what we need to do as a company. Could you expand on that? What can companies think about leveraging AI? That's what I'm getting at. What are some of your thoughts?
Yeah, so we see a lot of the Copilot use cases out there where you have an interactive chat window and you say, okay, well, I'm looking at whether it's an alert or an email, whatever that might be, because there's security Copilots and there are office Copilots, right? And that's been sort of how people have been interacting with generative AI so far, is through that chat interface. And the idea is you go onto that tool and you say, I have a need. I'm going to put this in there and ask this AI to fulfill my need. So it might be, the example from a Microsoft Office Copilot, summarize this email. It might be on a security Copilot, hey, tell me if this threat actor can get into my environment or something like that. But the fundamental problem with that is that it took a human to sit there and think about it and say, okay, here's what I need right now, and then put that in there. Hope that the AI can answer that question or do that task, and then come back and tell them what it did, or produce additional information. Then the human will look at it and decide, okay, is this enough, or what do I need to do next? And that's fine. That in some ways that's better, but I think it kind of misses the point, which is you're trying to have something, an industrial strength solution that gets work done for you, versus another place that you can type and read. And that's been my main issue, I think, with when I look around the industry and how people have been using this, powerful new generative AI. They're typically applying it in ways that don't really get the work done. They're just a different place to do work. And I think that's been my main issue with it. So what we've been looking to try to do is how do we do a lot of that in the background, or how do we, take steps that we know that you're going to do and do those for you, and then let you know after, what has happened, and then let you adjust it. And I think that's the difference, is instead of being a place where someone can approach and ask for work to get done, to say, look, we know what work's going to need to get done. Let's go ahead and do it. And I think one of the examples I've seen out there is a chat interface, and they say, tell me about this current alert. And it says, well, okay, here's, the stuff involved with the alert. They say, okay, well, does this match any, Intel hits that we might have? And it goes back and says, oh, yes, this alert matched this Intel hit. And I just stopped there for a second. I think, well, hang on, you knew that this event happened, you had this alert, and you knew that there was something malicious attached to it. Why on earth did this require an interaction? Why was there this back and forth, and why was AI involved at all? That was a simple match, right? And so that's what I mean by saying, okay, let's not treat AI as this complete new tool out there that's shiny, and we don't know how to treat it or what to expect. We do know what to expect. We want work to get done. And so we say, look, if we already know we've had this list of, malicious things, and that list of malicious things ever matches stuff that's occurring right now, then that's definitely bad. We want to know about that right away, and we want to take action on that. And so I think taking that approach and then working backwards and saying, okay, now where can we put AI in that? I think that's where you start to get a lot of the values to say, okay, now let's get, things happening in the background that are occurring, versus I'm going to sit here and, basically have a different command prompt to enter things into.
That's great. Thank you, Martin. In your presentation, the one I attended, you actually gave an example of AI use case, which was actually not possible. I think you said 6 months ago or 8 months ago, however long ago it was. Could you mention about that, and what kind of, just for users, for the listeners to get an idea, what kind of leap this AI is making just in few months?
Yeah, absolutely. So I remember the first time I started using generative AI was last March. So it's been about a year and a half plus. And I remember I was trying out one of those very first models, and we had some success with some of the smaller ones out there. But I remember one of them, I put in, some prompt, and it just started spitting out A's, a row of A's. I thought, this is not very helpful. And so that's kind of where we were only really a year and a half ago, is a lot of this stuff just flat out didn't work. It didn't understand anything. And then you fast forward just a short amount of time, and suddenly, it not only understands what you're asking, or, what data is being considered, it's also has almost the entire internet as a frame of reference for the kind of data that's interacting with. So the example that I used was, I think, new since June or July. And that was the ability for the AI to do what we call chain of thought, which is to consider multiple things at the same time, and then be able to use that reasoning as it says, well, if A and then B and then C, therefore D, right? And so it can put all of those things together and consider each one individually in the same prompt. And so that's what we call chain of thought, being able to reason through multiple things at the same time and take them all into consideration. And that really hasn't worked very well. If you even go back, in the May, June timeframe, that really wasn't possible. So, when I talk about those things, I mean, these are really fresh, new capabilities that have popped out, and everyone's kind of scrambling to figure out how they can use them and how effective they are and how do they manage this. And you see this huge new emergence, forget security for a second, just technologically, for saying, how do we do change management for something that, changes this frequently, right? These are complete new capabilities. In fact, just 3 weeks ago, Claude 3.5 version 2 came out from Anthropic, and you can now see it pause as it's writing out an answer and say, oh, I'm sorry, I made a mistake, and correct itself as it's printing out its very first answer, which is incredible. So they've added in these new capabilities where as it's answering, it's also double checking its own work. And that's brand new in the last 3-4 weeks. So
But
this
is
is
it,
how fast this stuff is going.
I mean, I get that it's kind of behaving like a human, but why is it starting to spit out a wrong answer to begin with? Why couldn't it start with the right answer?
That's a great question. I think, and I'd have to do a little bit of guessing here as to what Anthropic put into, Claude. They probably have essentially two competing thoughts occurring behind the scenes, and one is checking the other. So I think that's probably the right way to look at it. And again, I'm guessing here is exactly how Anthropic put it together, although they do release papers from time to time, so that may be out there. But that's generally what it looks like. Is there's sort of all the data that goes into training the models. That's sort of one area that gets improved upon. And so you'll see that frequently where, the model will say, based on my knowledge, which goes up until this specific date, right? Because that's it when it, went out and read everything on the internet. That's what was there at that time. And so anything in addition, it's going to have to go out and do external lookups or something like that. But they continually add on to that training. So that date is, moves forward, from month to month, basically. And so you're always getting later and later answers, which is great. So that's one thing that changes, is sort of that arena of data in which it can work, that the training set. But then on top of that, you also have the instructions that it's given. And so these are, when you think of fine tuning or however that is, that's some of where the chain of thought came from, where it's able to have that fine-tuned training to say, okay, when someone asks you this is really how you should respond. And that is a layer on top of the training data. So it has that base knowledge, then it's considering the base knowledge and deciding how best to respond to you, the user. And so that is part of the instruction set that gets updated regularly. And then on top of all of that is the API layer, where, and this is, I think, where it does that correction. And that's where, something like Anthropic or OpenAI has the ability to, at that application level, notice that something isn't exactly the way they want it, and add in, more traditional like programming to say, okay, when it gets to this point, stop it, and then bring in this other answer. And it's a combination of all of those things, but they have that opportunity at each layer to improve. And so that's why you see this change of pace so rapid, because any one of those three areas can be improved really in any given day or week. And so one of those typically will be, and that's why you can't expect the exact same answer, today that you had yesterday.
Yeah, that's amazing. So going back to your point about chain of thought being a new capability of AI, do you have an example or a use case where the chain of thought would be useful for users of AI?
Yeah, absolutely. So in the example that we use, we have basically a guidance framework that we give the AI in order to evaluate a given security alert. And so instead of just giving the alert to the AI and saying, hey, what do you think? We give it a guidance framework so that we can get the same style of response every time. That's really important in anything non-trivial like security, where the answers matter a great deal. There could be lives on the line in certain cases, right? And so by giving it a little more to go on than just saying, hey, go be as creative as you want to be, we're able to get it to think through a number of pieces of this, whatever security alert it's looking at, so that it is chaining together those thoughts and evaluating things in exactly the right way. And that's not really dissimilar to how you would teach a child in school, right? You say, if you're going to solve this math problem, here's the right way to solve the math problem, and you give the student a framework to go through. So I think this is part of sort of a mini education where we say, this is how we expect the result. Or you can think of just any workplace, you have a handbook of your workplace, or this normal procedures that you follow, for whether it's timesheets or anything like that, right? And you say, okay, here's how we expect this. So I think, and back to not thinking about AI as a shiny new thing, but just as a tool that we can use, and having those expectations to say, look, this isn't magic. You don't just throw some text at it and then hope that it responds exactly the same way that you want. You give it the exact requirements and guidance that you expect, so that you get the same answer every time. So in our case, we say, all right, look, when you're evaluating an alert, think through it this way. Think through the user, think through any of the host names or IP addresses that are involved, and then think through, the attacker involved, look at all of that, try to build a story, and then figure out, hey, based on the story, does it look like this thing was successful? Yes or no? Then from there, do you think that this is extra bad or not? And by giving it that framework and process to go through, that guarantees that you're going to get that same, proper response every time versus something that's more hit and miss because it's getting extra creative.
Interesting. So in that case, do you train your AI in terms of what is a red flag versus what is not a red flag? Kind of you give that framework to AI. Otherwise, it wouldn't know how to flag content, right?
Well, that's what's been most interesting to me is that, and again, back to your one of your first questions here about how fast things are moving. If you went and tried to do this last year, you absolutely would have to do a fair amount of fine tuning or even pre-training to tell it what's good and bad. But now, because it's read the entire internet, it knows the MITRE ATT&CK framework. It knows, the OWASP top 10 for, all the various OWASP top 10s out there. It's read pretty much every published security incident that's out there. And so it already knows what's good and what's bad. And this is kind of the really counterintuitive part. We as technologists, and especially security technologists, just kind of approach everything as, oh, we have to do training. We have to do training. If we don't tell it what's bad, it won't know what's bad, or it'll make the wrong decision. But that's actually not true anymore. Because it has read things and understands them like a human does, you don't really have to tell it what's good and bad. In fact, this is where you have to find that sweet spot between giving it a guidance framework, like I just explained, and letting it ascertain what is in fact going on and what is malicious in the evidence that you've presented. And so I think one of the, as I said, the counterintuitive parts to this is that you actually don't want to train it at that level because you don't want to influence its decision. It already has all the information between, basically the alert that you have in hand and the story that the data tells around it, and everything is read about. So you think about someone in the security industry with a lot of experience, they have that experience because they've been around, they've done incident response or something like that, or they've, operated in a security operations center, however that might be, right? And that's very similar to the AI reading about these stories that have come out from those places. And so it's operating with that level of experience. So you take someone that's been experienced and you give them, an alert when the story around that alert, and they'll probably be able to read that and tell you whether something is important or not. And it's very similar for AI. So if you're able to give it enough story to go on, then it'll make the right decision. And so what we have is a really unique scenario now. This is completely novel, where it's really up to the organization to be able to give the AI enough information to make the decision. It's not about training the AI itself. And so really the difference between success and failure in this setup is, did you have enough, a long enough story to tell it? Does it have enough to go on to be able to make a good decision? And that's it. That's really what it comes down to. Most of the other factors really fall away.
So when you say long enough story, you're talking about the input that you give to AI. Basically,
Right.
what you're saying is, if I understand correctly, give the AI enough information. In this case, sounds like more is better, right? More information in regards to what we are asking from AI. And in that, once we do that, then the AI can use the internet and it's processing techniques to identify things for us.
That's right.
Right.
It's and to be clear, it's not just the total amount of data or the length of the story that matters. It's the quality of it. And again, you could just kind of go back to, if I gave this to a human, would they have anything to go on here? And that's really the litmus test for it is, what did the data describe? Was it just the same thing over and over, but in a large amount of data? That's not very helpful. You need a broad, contextual look at what's going on. So for a security alert, who is involved, what's their role, what do they usually do? For the system involved, it's, well, what's the role of that system in the organization? Is it a domain controller? Is it a laptop, right? All those things are really important. And then you can even go down to the vulnerability management layers. So did it have a lot of existing vulnerabilities on it? Was it exposed to the internet? These are all things that any seasoned SOC analyst would be asking, and it's the same for generative AI. The more information like that you can give it, the better answer it's going to have, to the point where it will be better than a human in a lot of cases. And that may sound a little bit scary at first, but actually it's great, because I have a lot of different analogies in the physical world, but I think farm machinery is a good one. You expect farm machinery to be better at a human for harvesting something like wheat or hay, right? And you wouldn't want to be out there doing that by hand. You're expecting a combine or some large farm equipment to do that, and it's better than a human at doing that. But that's actually a good thing, right? Because you're trying to harvest a lot of crops at the
Yeah.
as quickly as possible.
Who knows? Initially, the farm machine may have come across some protest or some people not wanting to use it. It's a similar thing probably with AI too. Some people may be scared of losing their jobs, but like you said, it's just like any other tool. It's only going to help us do our jobs better. But one difference, I don't know if it's really a difference. You can correct me if I'm wrong. With employing a human on a task like what you mentioned, SOC analyst in that example, a SOC analyst would come back and ask me if I did not give him or her enough information, right? Would the AI do that? Would it ask you, hey, Martin, you are missing this piece of information? Or would it just assume things or just go off of what it has available?
So that's an area that we are actively exploring right now. And we've got a number of really good examples of where we could say, if you're unsure about anything, or if your confidence level is below this, then tell us what you would need in order to raise your confidence level. And that actually goes into what we call agentic frameworks, which are the ability to go out and actually take actions. And so for some of these, it can be very simple, where the AI says, okay, in order to make a better decision, I'm going to need to go out and gather this additional information. And then we have codified, in our case, additional queries or orchestration actions that it can go and do, bring that information back, and then reevaluate it. So yes, it can absolutely say what would help it. And part of that is because it fundamentally understands what it's looking at. So if it says, I'm looking at a username, but I don't know their job profile, it knows that a directory would give them that job profile, and it would say, I need a connection to something like Active Directory or Google Workspace in order to understand who this person is in context with their environment. So this is what I need now. So it very much will say what it needs and then be able to build that into a loop.
Okay, that's helpful to know. So generative AI in current state, if I'm using OpenAI, for example, do I need to tell the tool to get back to me if its confidence level is below a certain percentage? Is that how I train the tool? Is that the right prompt?
Yeah, that's how you would use it, right? And it takes a fair amount of work to get that right. This isn't super simple or easy to have it reliable. You can get sort of an example of where it does work pretty quickly, but to say, okay, I'm going to build an entire system around this and test it and make sure that it's working properly, then that takes a lot of work. And that's what we're doing right now. And this is an agentic framework. And part of that is the second you say, I'm going to have AI take an action, well, now you better be very, very sure that the AI is taking the right actions, that doesn't have too much permission to do something that you don't want it to do. And you have to have full confidence in everything that's occurring. So it's a very big difference between saying, okay, we're going to have AI read something and give us its opinion, and having AI read something and then take an action, right? World of difference there.
Absolutely, absolutely. You mentioned about chatbot as an example earlier, because that's one use case. A lot of companies are using AI as a chatbot. And we know what happened with Air Canada, and there were some videos and posts about users manipulating AI, asking AI to call itself in a different name or something different, or even swear on people and stuff like that. So what can companies do to prevent that from happening? How do they train the chatbots such that those things do not happen?
So this has become a area of significant work here just in the last few months. And you've seen a lot of releases from hyperscalers, from the providers themselves, for adding in ways to do what we call grounding, which is providing documents that provide the factual basis for a response. And that goes directly towards that issue that Air Canada ran into, where the bot responded with something that was incorrect. So you're seeing a lot of sort of fixes for that kind of thing. And I say fixes because that's going to correct an answer that was about to be delivered. And it's very similar to that first example I provided, where that Claude will now stop its answer mid-sentence and say, wait, nope, I'm wrong. Hang on, I got to correct this. And it's largely because of that situation. So it's become very interesting to see mechanically how you keep something from making a mistake. And I've been talking about the advances that we're seeing, but especially for factual lookups, your mileage definitely varies. So just yesterday, I was raking leaves, and I was trying to remember what I live in Madison, the city of Madison streets pickup policy was. So I got ChatGPT and I said, well, we'll test it here. And so I put in, I said, what is the leaf pickup policy for, and I put in my zip code, and it responded with Salt Lake City. So that was not correct, right? I said, no, use the zip code. It said, oh, okay. And then it said, yep, here you go. And it had the right phone number, had all the right stuff. But my point is, I had to tell it, no, you're wrong. You got to go back and correct that. So we're far from perfect on what they're able to do right now for factual lookups. And that's why this is such an area of investigation right now and research.
Right, you had enough knowledge. The stakes are low here, so you were able to correct it, right? If you were a foreigner, you had no idea between Madison and Salt Lake City, you probably would have accepted that response and moved on. So yeah, that's good. I mean, seems like AI tools needs to still develop. They're still under development, but they have gone a long way compared to, like you said, March of last year to where we are now. They've definitely come across a long way. I know you're using AI for fighting cyber threats. What about the other side? How do you think, or what are things that are already happening in terms of AI being leveraged for the cyber threats by the bad actors?
Yeah, there's a lot of different areas for that, and some are pretty obvious, right? You see, the phishing is the big one. And it's and we see this all over. Trying to discern whether or not a human created a document these days is very difficult, right? There's a few telltale signs for, did it use a lot of bullets? Did it do this, right? For if, a teacher's trying to catch someone that's been using ChatGPT to write their assignments or something like that. And it's not too different when you're looking at phishing emails, trying to figure out if that's authentic. So those are ones that we know that we need to fight against and are pretty obvious. But I think the vast majority of the harm, I guess I would say, that can be inflicted by attackers using AI is going to come from a much more generic kind of place, where they're using it to write better code, they're using it to do more research, they're using it to write helper frameworks for taking in ransomware payments. I mean, those are all things that used to take the attackers a lot longer. And now they have power tools just like the good guys do. So essentially, they can do more bad things and faster because they have access to these tools that accelerate what people are doing. So I think that productivity side to AI is definitely a double-edged sword in this case. However, it's a lot harder to point at a specific instance of something happening. It's like, oh, that was because of generative AI. So I think what you're seeing is that attacks in general are getting worse and more frequent because the attackers have essentially leveled up by increasing their infrastructure, writing better malware, whatever that might be, all because of generative AI. But it's harder to have, this marquee instance to point at and say, oh, that was because specifically of generative AI. But it is, we can't go back. It's present. Even for the large providers like OpenAI and Anthropic and others, putting some guardrails on there and saying, oh, you can't ask that. We'll filter that out, or we'll prevent this kind of prompt from being entered. That doesn't matter. There's so many open source LLMs out there that are very, very good that the attackers can run those locally. I mean, you can run a very good LLM on your laptop. So just because there are, preventions in place on some of the public APIs out there, that doesn't matter at all. There's very good ways to write code locally on a laptop that's not connected to the internet.
I see. Wow, interesting. Okay. Well, which is why we need people like you who are always fighting against these cyber threats, leveraging AI, right? So that's great. What are some of the AI tools that you are using? I'm just curious because a lot of us heard about are using OpenAI. Copilot is another name we hear about. I'm just curious, what are the AI tools that are out there, and what are the AI tools that you are using?
Yeah, so for personal use, I've used ChatGPT for a while. Do be aware that they're not great with privacy in general, especially if you're using the free version. So just be aware of what you're putting in there. That
Yep.
they're probably training on your data. Most of us are kind of used to that from things like Gmail, where that's sort of the agreement going in. So I think
Right.
we're fairly used to that, at a personal level. However, at a corporate level or an institutional level, that's a different story. So
Yep.
do be aware of the privacy implications of the AI that you're using, especially if you're not paying for it, because as you've heard the saying, if something is free, then you are the product. That's
Yeah.
very true on these as well. So be careful, especially with OpenAI. Anthropic has taken sort of a stance to say they're going to be better about privacy. So if you take them at their word, then I think you're a little better off there. But then, as I said, you can actually run a lot of this locally. And so pretty much any MacBook or decent sized Windows machine can run a local LLM, and it's actually not too hard to get started with them if you're especially technically minded and interested in getting going with that. That's something fun to experiment with. So those are out there. And I think that you've seen the Apple Intelligence now. I mean, that's out there. I'm not super impressed with the use cases for that right now, but I think, over the next few years, you'll start to see those manufacturers come up with much better use cases for the AI. But the key, as you've heard me say, is that you can do a lot with a little hardware. And the kinds of decisions that you can make even on locally on your laptop are so good that you're going to start to see a lot of things able to be done just locally on the device. And that's going to make a big difference. So that essentially means that we'll now have the ability to have machines start making a lot of decisions that humans didn't have time to make. And I think that's going to be essentially the largest category of some of this new emerging use cases for generative AI.
Yeah. So if I run local LLM, can it still talk to internet and get information from internet as well?
It can, yes. So that's the agentic workflow that I described, which is especially interesting. So essentially, with a little bit of Python and any of these running, and in fact, I'm sure there's some frameworks you can grab right now that pretty much have this baked in. You can have your local laptop do the reasoning, and anytime it needs information that it doesn't have, it'll basically fire off a call out to Google or the internet or whatever to bring down the information, consider it, and then continue. This is basically the next phase that we're in now with generative AI in general, is to say that it's agentic and that it's going to go out and do, get things, do things, whatever that might be. When before it was just you hope that it was in the information it had been trained on, and if it wasn't, then out of luck, and it'll tell you, oh, sorry, I don't know that, I wasn't trained on it. Now, any of, like I mentioned, OpenAI or Anthropic, they will all happily go out to the internet. The example I gave with leaf collection, that's what it did. It wasn't trained on that. It just went out to the website behind the scenes, grabbed the answer, brought it back, and said, "Here's the answer." And in fact, anyone's used Google over the the last year, you've seen them put that front and center now. Whenever you type something into Google, Gemini will give it a shot and see if it knows the answer first before moving on. So very similar, and it's all related. That's really where things have been moving and will continue to move even more.
Got it. Okay. Well, that's great. You mentioned during your presentation, you mentioned about the image creation using AI is still not very much progressed yet. There is a lot more work to do on that area. Are there any other areas where you think AI hasn't caught up or hasn't made significant progress yet?
Yeah, the image, it's not just the generation is okay, not great. I think most of us can still identify when an image has been created by AI or get pretty close. Not all of them. Some of them are pretty good. But if I will say, for instance, Adobe has put in a lot of time and effort to try to make their version of their AI pretty good at doing some image editing. And it's gotten further, but I'd say it's still a long way. It's not nearly as easy to use as the textual-based stuff. So normally if you say, oh, actually, I wanted it this way, anything that's text-based, immediately you get the right answer. You know, if it was wrong the first time, one more shot, you got it. But visual stuff is so much harder because what we see with our eyes and how we interpret that is so much more nuanced than even, you know, language. And so when we say, oh no, that's a little bit off, I actually wanted it like this, and then you ask for it, you know, it's still very time consuming to get things exactly the right way visually because, you know, we as humans are so adept at seeing tiny little differences or nuances in the images that we're looking at, and you know, whether it's lighting or any of that stuff. So it's improving over time, but it's improving much more slowly than we're seeing in the more programmatic things or anything that's text-based or machine-based. That's been moving much more quickly. I will say one area that I haven't done a ton of reading on, so I'm not an expert on this, but it's very encouraging, is a lot of like molecular biology. And I mean, there's been reports just in the last few months about you can give AI essentially any molecular structure and it'll find something like a vaccine against that protein or something like that. So that's very encouraging to me and why I'm very optimistic about humanity and generative AI being a very good thing for it, because I think there's a lot of unsolved problems that we've got. And I think that this can go very far to helping us with some really important stuff like, yeah, imagine if you could instantly create any protein that you wanted, no problem, and have the framework around it to test it and do all of that, right? So I think these are some areas that are emerging that are very valuable for all of us. And I think we also have the knowledge that we can, you know, set up those testing frameworks. So I mean, as soon as you say, oh, what if we did this? There's always the question about, well, is it safe? What would happen if we did this? And that's okay. We should have those questions. We should have that caution. But I think that there are some, you know, very traditional safety frameworks that you can put around these uses of generative AI to make sure that we are safely getting those benefits. And I don't think that's going to take, you know, nearly as much area of research to figure out how to safely do these things, because the output is essentially the same as if a human did it, and we already know how to test that. So I think we'll actually see this stuff accelerate a lot just in the next couple of years. Where, you know, back to the chatbot issue. Well, all we know how to do right now with AI is chatbots. Well, just hang on. We're moving very quickly on a lot of these other, you know, whether it's material science, you know, physics, all these other areas where we just weren't smart enough, and we didn't have enough time in the day to figure things out. Well, it turns out now generative AI can really do that for us because now it knows how to do things like chain of thought and reasoning and put things together. And we're just now starting to see that. There's been a ton of interviews with Sam Altman of OpenAI talking more about this, and he's got the 2 to 5 year approach on this, I think, is kind of the time frame that he's using. And I think he's probably being a little cautious with that. I think it's probably more in the 1 to 2 year that we're going to start to see, you know, what he calls AGI, but basically something that can take that agentic workflow I talked about and go, you know, much further than that. But I think that's all going to be very good for us because there's a lot of work to do out there, and we could really use some help.
Absolutely. That's great. So if you were to predict the future of AI, say in the next 5 years, what do you think, where do you think we will be in terms of AI 5 years from now?
Well, one of the points that I made in the talk that you guys were so nice to have me for at Harper just a few weeks ago, it really it came back to being able to figure out how to use this faster and better, but much more safely. And I think that's really the key to this: is how do we figure out building in those underlying safety frameworks, being able to build in the things that make us feel safe when we use them. And so a lot of that comes back to the transparency and understanding as it's making decisions, why is it making that? And that's actually been really easy to see because it's so good at describing exactly what it thinks at all times. And that's been a huge part of this. So I talked before about sort of that difference between it evaluating something and having a story around it and then taking action, right? And there's such a a leap of faith required to say, okay, we're going to allow this thing to make changes. But you can get there if you can understand why it's making that decision, and it's very good at communicating. And I think that is really what will accelerate this going forward. So when we talk about the 2 to 5 year time range, I think the bridge to getting there is going to be us being able to read why it's making these decisions, trust that it's making the right decision, and saying, yes, I'm okay with that. So it's that audibility and transparency that's going to get us there. And I think what you start to see is workflows. And I look at this from a security lens, and I think that's really what it's about, is being able to have that ability to see what's going on. But I think you can go broader than that and say, this is true for pretty much any industry, where the job goes from actually making the decision to feeding it enough information that it has to make the decision, and then auditing the decisions that it's made. That's a big difference. And I think it's, I mean, back to, whether it's farm machinery or, think of an assembly line, instead of building something by hand, now you're making sure that the machines have the materials that you're inputting into the machine to make it, and you're auditing what's coming out to make sure that it's correct. Right. And that's, I think, what we're going to be is, again, this is an industrial strength thinking machine. So are you putting the right data in, and are you auditing what's coming out to make sure that it is in fact accurate? And I think the other parts of this, if you, back to the statement about, well, how do you catch when it makes a mistake? So I said, well, I don't live in Salt Lake City, so I know that's wrong. Well, forget that specific question. That's an easy one. What if I had no idea what the answer was, right? I think you raised that. And so if we say, how would you be able to correct it if you're not an expert in it? I think that is one of the big challenges that we're going to have. And there's a couple of different ways that you can have essentially, AI police AI and try to, correct itself. And like I said, with the Claude example of it correcting itself mid-sentence, that you're starting to see that a little bit. But that doesn't make you feel very good to think that, well, we're just going to bet everything on AI and assume that it's correct all the time, right? So I think that is probably one of the biggest challenges that we have going forward, is how do we maintain our own ability to audit what it's doing and to know if it is correct. And some of that's just experimentation. Like I said, if a human had done it, you wouldn't just trust it inherently, right? You would test it, you'd question it, you'd go through all that. So it's going to be up to us to make sure we're still in a state that we can do that. And I think that is going to be the real emphasis, to make sure that we have the ability to audit what's happening. But if we can do that, back to your question about 5 years out, I think you could see things like faster than light travel. I mean, you pull out every sci-fi idea out there. I think that's how you get there. I mean, we've had a few hundred years where we've kind of understand theory of relativity and things like that, or not relativity 100 years, but if you go back to Newton, right, in the physics realm, if we talk sci-fi things. And while we've made lots of advancements, we're still moving fairly slowly. I think you'll see that change of pace, accelerate dramatically here over the next couple of years. And that is going to be what I think will be truly impressive over, the 2 to 5 year range, is how do we take the new research that AI has created and then create that in the material world. And there will be feedback loops where that starts to accelerate. So you're going to see an absolute geometric curve there, which is really exciting.
That's great. Yeah, that we need that kind of a change. This is wonderful. What do you think are going to be impacts to job in general because of AI? That's one most popular concern or question that people have. What's going to happen to my job? So what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, that's the quintessential question, right? How is this going to change the workplace? And I think long term, it's going to be phenomenally better. And I say that because right now, when you think through what people are doing and ask yourself, what percentage of the time are people doing what they want to be doing? It's often not very high.
Very true. Yeah.
And I think, the ultimate goal here is humanist, is to say, well, how can we do more of what we want to do? but acknowledging that, you know, if you're always on vacation, you're going to get bored, right? People need purpose. They need things like that. So it's, you know, it's not to say, oh, we'll just have robots do everything and everyone will be happy. That's not what I'm saying. I think it's allowing people to do what they want to do, and AI is going to start doing a lot more of the things that they don't care about. So I happen to have a Roomba. It does the vacuuming for me. I like that. I don't want to be doing the vacuuming. So that's, you know, I think the best case scenario here that we're looking at is the, you know, thought Roombas or, you know, whatever you want to call that in tech, and how that's going to be happening. But you know, back to the Roomba analogy, it misses spots. It needs help sometimes, right? It's not like, oh well, this house doesn't have to be cleaned anymore because I have a Roomba. No, there's lots of other things that have to happen, but it's fewer things. So for at least a while now, that's kind of be where we're at, is that incrementally we'll have fewer and fewer annoying things that we have to do. I think you could probably say that about technology in general for the most part. Certainly there's people, you know, not that many years ago didn't have to spend nearly as much time dealing with software upgrades as we do today. And I'm not sure anybody wants to be doing software upgrades. So it's not that technology solves all your problems necessarily. But I think that is kind of the idea, is that we'll see a lot fewer of the things that we don't want to do not exist anymore. So the question about, well, how does that impact jobs? I think there will be some very specific ones that are, you know, impacted quite a bit, as within, and this is the pattern within any tech, right? But I think that that is not going to impact overall workforces in the way that we think it will. I think it'll slowly shift what people actually do in their job to some extent. And I think when you look at it from a, you know, macroecon, you know, how does this affect GDP? GDP will skyrocket. You'll see massive productivity boosts, which is all good news in the end. For very specific places, maybe that'll be harder. I wouldn't even say exactly what those professions are that will be most impacted, because I think you've seen quite a bit of that already. You know, whether it's you know, the internet, it's people, you know, after the pandemic, people working from home. You know, there's been a lot of big changes already, and even massive changes like, you know, the pandemic didn't really impact, you know, day to day for a lot of people, you know, after that, even though we all learned to, you know, use Zoom and things like that. I think that you'll see some changes, but I would say probably 95% of professions won't change nearly as dramatically as I think we're worried about. But I think the changes that are going to happen will be for the better. But yeah, there aren't too many that I think are going to be, you know, completely wholesale replaced by AI. Even the ones that I think people are most worried about, because it's often not the actual work product that is being produced. It's a lot more about the human, you know, connectivity and relationship, whether you call that sales or customer service, whatever that might be, that comes into it. And even if you think about, okay, customer support chatbots, that's not a human. It's not going to be a human. That's a big difference, and going to remain a big difference. So I don't think you're going to see too much of a shakeup across all professions or anything like that. I think that, and my hope is that you'll just have a lot less of the boring work to do there. And my hope is that that means that there's a lot more time for professors to spend in office hours versus, you know, typing things up or whatever that might be. You know, take whatever analogy you like. But to be spending time on the things that we weren't able to do before. In security, that's things like making sure we have more of the right data to put into a system versus clicking through every last alert. So there's kind of that thought process, but applied to, you know, pretty much any profession.
Okay, that's wonderful. That's great. Well, before we conclude, Martin, what business book would you recommend for my audience?
Oh, Guns, Germs, and Steel by Jared Diamond. Still one of my favorite from college. And, you know, I think it's, we'll call it out of date. I mean, you know, it's, geez, 25 years old now, I think, somewhere in there. And I'm sure that a lot of the specific economics that Jared Diamond refers to in there are a little out of date, but I think it's the thinking in systems and the approach to looking at just the sheer data and how things interact versus saying, well, you know, here are my fundamental understandings of, well, this, you know, when this happens, then this happens, right? And you know, that's all baked into a history of written by the winners and bias and all those kinds of things. And what I loved about that book was being able to look at just the interactivity between things and kind of reverse engineer how stuff happened based on some factors that you wouldn't normally think of. So even if he's wrong about whatever assumptions he made about he talks about the shape of the continents and how that impacted travel and how that impacted how technology spread. While that might be true or false, I think the concept of saying, hey, there's things that we haven't thought about yet that might very much affect what's going on here, and how could we test that, and if we test that, then how do we move forward with that information? So that's why I love that book, and I'm thinking that AI is actually going to help us a lot in areas like that, where we'll say, I'm not biased in any way, so I noticed this. Has anyone considered this? I'll consider this. I'll take a look at it. And I think that's the kind of research we're going to start to get out of it.
That's great. Thank you. That sounds like it's one of those timeless books, which I haven't had a chance to read yet. So thank you for mentioning it. Lastly, where can people find you, Martin?
Martin Holste on LinkedIn. I would recommend send me a request out there, and happy to meet you.
Wonderful. Martin, it's been a pleasure to talk to you. I've learned quite a bit. Wonderful and engaging information. Thank you for sharing, and thank you for joining us today.
Thank you for having me. It's been great.
Don't forget to like this video, subscribe to this channel and turn on notification bell to stay updated for future episodes.